My name is Lorelei Sterling. I am 18 years old and I secured my multi-million-dollar inheritance under a linen tablecloth, while my father toasted to a future he was actively trying to steal. The crystal chandelier above our table hummed with a low vibration, casting amber light over 80 invited guests who cared very little about whose birthday it actually was. My father smiled for the country club photographer holding a glass of vintage champagne, unaware that the Reno commercial plaza he planned to sell the next morning was already gone. I tapped the final confirmation on my encrypted phone, legally locking my late grandparents' estate into an irrevocable Nevada trust. 12 seconds. That is how long it took to dismantle a fraud. Welcome back to Fluffy Revenge, where quiet women audit the family ledger and balance the scales. If you have ever watched your family smile for the cameras while robbing you in the shadows, tell me your age in the comments, and subscribe because you will want to hear how I handed my father a pen to sign his own ruin. Let me back up 2 weeks. I am a finance student at the university, and I live in a gated Las Vegas community where the only thing thicker than the desert heat is the debt. My parents, Richard and Sylvia, treat wealth as a performance art. They pay $60,000 a year in country club dues, using bridge loans and exhausted credit lines. My 16-year-old sister Harper is their golden liability. They fund her with luxury cars and allowances they cannot afford just to keep up appearances and mask the decay underneath. I am the family auditor. I am the quiet daughter whose needs are categorized as negligible expenses. The core of our family tension was always the Reno Plaza. My grandparents saw through my father long before I did. They knew Richard treated money like water, so they bypassed him. They left a highly lucrative commercial property directly to me, placed in a custodial account that would transfer to my sole control the exact minute I turned 18. My parents never saw that plaza as my future. They saw it as an untapped equity line for their own survival. For years, I watched them hemorrhage cash. I quietly tracked their sinking net worth on my laptop, calculating their margins, waiting for the day they would try to claim my legacy as their own. The first move happened on a Tuesday. I was sitting at the kitchen island running statistical models for a midterm when my mother walked in. Sylvia operates with a bright, weaponized sweetness. She slid a sleek folder across the marble counter, placed a heavy gold monogrammed pen on top of it, and poured herself a cup of coffee. She told me it was just some routine tax paperwork, a boring administrative chore we needed to clear up before my birthday dinner. In our house, compliance is expected, but you do not hand unread contracts to a finance major. I opened the folder. The first 2 pages were standard revenue service forms, boilerplate, and harmless. Then I flipped to the 3rd page. It was a custodial release authorization. Buried in the fine print was a clause granting my father irrevocable power of attorney to list and sell the Reno property. I did not confront her. I did not scream or demand an explanation. I have spent my life watching my parents manage their image, and I knew panic was a luxury I could not afford. I closed the folder, rubbed my temples, and told her I felt a migraine coming on. I promised to review and sign the paperwork after I took some medication. She smiled, kissed the top of my head, and told me to rest. I took the folder to my room, locked the door, and opened my laptop. I logged into the county assessor portal. My hands were steady. What I found was a pending purchase agreement for my Reno Plaza. The buyer was a ruthless commercial real estate firm called the Preston Group. The contract was negotiated and signed by Richard Sterling in his capacity as my underage custodian. The closing date was scheduled for exactly 2 days after my 18th birthday. I pulled up the property records and cross-referenced the recent filings. My father had taken out multiple high-interest bridge loans against the impending sale. The math was cold and undeniable. If the sale did not close, my parents would face financial ruin. The bank would foreclose on the Las Vegas house. The lenders would call the debts. My father would face wire fraud charges for misrepresenting his authority to sell an asset that would no longer be under his control. I sat in the blue light of my screen and updated my spreadsheet. This was not just parental greed. This was an existential margin call, and I was the designated sacrificial lamb. My parents loved their country club status far more than they loved me. I realized then that I could not save them, and I no longer wanted to. I skipped my afternoon classes and drove downtown to meet with an estate attorney named Valerie Quinn. She did not treat me like a child. She treated me like a high-net-worth client facing hostile creditors. Nevada is a premier financial trust haven famous for its ironclad asset protection laws, and Valerie knew exactly how to use them. We drafted a Nevada Asset Protection Trust. The legal strategy was a masterpiece of bureaucratic retaliation. The trust was structured so that the exact minute I turned 18, the deed to the Reno plaza would automatically transfer into the irrevocable trust. It legally shielded the asset from any creditor's bridge loans or custodial sales initiated by my father. I paid her retainer in cash saved from my tutoring jobs. I left her office with a pristine manila folder knowing I held the ultimate trump card. I did not have to fight my family. I just had to wait for the clock to strike midnight. To understand the exact mechanics of a bloodline betraying its own, you have to stop looking at the Sterlings as a family. You must look at us as a failing corporation. In our household, affection was never measured in hugs or shared quiet moments. It was measured in allocations. Richard and Sylvia operated our lives on a strict ledger of appearances. We lived behind wrought iron security gates in one of the most exclusive zip codes in Las Vegas. The driveway was always paved with imported stone, and the landscaping was kept impossibly green against the punishing desert climate. But the pristine stucco walls of our 6-bedroom estate hid a foundation that was rotting from the inside out. My parents were drowning in performative debt. Richard liked to call himself a venture capitalist, which was a polite social fiction for a man who moved other people's money around, until it disappeared. Sylvia treated her social standing like a full-time career. She hosted charity galas, bought designer gowns she wore exactly once, and maintained a standing appointment at a salon that charged more than a monthly car payment. To sustain this illusion, they relied on a chaotic web of maxed-out credit lines, secondary mortgages, and desperate short-term loans. I knew this because I was the one who sorted the mail. I recognized the distinct red ink of final notices before I was old enough to drive. In this corporate structure, my younger sister Harper was classified as a high-yield liability. She was the golden child, the perfect aesthetic accessory for a mother obsessed with optics. Harper demanded, and Harper received. She required seasonal wardrobe updates, elite cheerleading camps, and premium electronics. My parents funded her existence without hesitation, viewing her extravagant lifestyle as a necessary operational cost. Keeping Harper draped in luxury signaled to the neighbors that the Sterling accounts were overflowing. Harper threw tantrums when a vacation was booked at a 4-star resort instead of a 5-star property, and Richard would simply pull out another platinum card to upgrade the reservation. She was the mascot for their delusion. I conversely was categorized as a negligible expense. I was the quiet daughter, the dependable one who never asked for new clothes, who earned academic scholarships, and who stayed in her room studying while the rest of the house performed for guests. Being low maintenance in a household running on fumes meant I was essentially invisible. I did not cost them social capital, but I did not earn them any either. My silence was convenient. They assumed my lack of demands equaled a lack of awareness. They mistook my observation for obedience. I spent my teenage years utilizing my finance studies to quietly track the trajectory of their sinking net worth. When other girls my age were reading fashion magazines, I was analyzing amortization schedules and tracking local real estate trends. I learned how to read a balance sheet by reverse engineering the panic in my father's voice when he took phone calls behind closed doors. I tracked the frequency of those calls. I noted when the least luxury SUVs were quietly traded in for slightly older models. I calculated their burn rate. The math was stark and unforgiving. The Sterling enterprise was bleeding out, and there was only one asset capable of keeping them solvent: That asset was a commercial real estate plaza located 400 miles north in the heart of Reno. My maternal grandparents were quiet, practical people who built their wealth through decades of cautious, unglamorous investments. They lived in a modest ranch house, drove sensible sedans, and viewed my father's flashy Las Vegas lifestyle with deep, unyielding suspicion. My grandfather used to sit on his porch watch Richard brag about his latest leveraged buyout and simply shake his head. They saw the decay beneath the designer suits. They knew Richard would eventually consume every dollar he could reach. When my grandparents passed away during my freshman year of high school, they left a final, irrevocable statement of their distrust. They bypassed Richard and Sylvia entirely. They did not leave a single cent to my parents. Instead, they directed their most lucrative holding, the Reno Plaza, directly to me. The property was a cornerstone of steady, reliable income. It was anchored by a national pharmacy chain and a high-end grocery store, generating substantial commercial lease payments every single month. Because I was a minor, the asset was placed into a strict custodial account. The legal stipulations were crystal clear. The trust provided a modest allowance for my direct educational needs, but the principal asset and its accumulated revenue were locked away. The deed and full control would transfer solely into my name on the exact day I turned 18. My parents hated that plaza. They resented its existence, and they resented me for owning it. In their minds, the property was not a secure foundation for their daughter's future. It was a cruel, unfair withholding of funds that rightfully belonged to them. They viewed it as an untapped equity line, a vast reservoir of capital sitting uselessly behind a glass wall they were forbidden to break. Over the years, the resentment morphed into entitlement. Sylvia would casually mention how unfair it was that my grandparents had tied up the family resources. Richard would pace the kitchen, muttering about how much capital he could generate if he were allowed to manage the Reno portfolio. They never spoke of the plaza as my inheritance. They spoke of it as their delayed payout. I sat at the kitchen island doing my homework, listening to their thinly veiled grievances, and I understood the assignment. I realized very early on that I was not living with caregivers. I was living with predators who were simply waiting for the timer to expire. I knew the day would come. I knew that as my 18th birthday approached, their financial desperation would intersect with their sense of entitlement. The bridge loans would come due. The credit cards would reach their limits, and they would look at my coming of age not as a milestone to celebrate, but as the unlocking of a vault. They assumed I was just a naive teenager, a passive vessel holding a deed I did not understand how to protect. They believed I would hand over the keys out of familial loyalty or simple ignorance. They expected me to be grateful for the privilege of saving them. But I had spent 4 years preparing for this exact collision. I had scrutinized every tax form they left on the counter. I had memorized the clauses of my grandparents' custodial arrangement. I had audited my own family, and I had already drafted the closing statement in my head. My emotional detachment was not born out of cruelty. It was a survival mechanism. If I allowed myself to feel the profound betrayal of a mother and father plotting to strip mine my future, I would have crumbled. So I boxed up the grief and replaced it with clinical precision. I stopped wishing for parents who would protect me, and I became an auditor preparing to defend my ledger. I watched them stage the fake smiles, order the expensive birthday cake, and polish the heavy gold pen they intended to use for my financial execution. I knew the ambush was coming, and I was ready. 2 weeks before the country club dinner, the house operated under its usual veneer of flawless domesticity. I sat at the expansive marble kitchen island, my textbooks stacked neatly beside a half-empty glass of iced water. I was running a comparative analysis on municipal bonds for my advanced finance seminar, matching yields against projected inflation rates. The quiet hum of the central air conditioning provided a steady background noise to the scrolling spreadsheets on my laptop screen. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of quiet hour where the true nature of our household usually revealed itself. Harper was at a cheerleading clinic, perfecting routines we could not actually afford to fund. Richard was locked in his home office down the hall. He claimed he was executing high-level trades, but the muffled, tense cadence of his voice through the heavy oak door suggested he was fielding calls from impatient lenders. I kept my head down, entering data into my ledger, pretending the sterile environment of the kitchen was an isolated sanctuary. The illusion of peace shattered the moment Sylvia walked into the room. My mother never simply entered a space. She descended upon it with a curated aura of busy importance. She wore a pristine white tennis skirt and a cashmere sweater draped casually over her shoulders, looking fresh from a country club luncheon. Her heels clicked against the polished porcelain tiles in a sharp rhythmic staccato. She carried a sleek black folder tucked under her arm. I watched her approach from the corner of my eye, noting the deliberate softness in her expression. Sylvia operated with a bright, weaponized sweetness whenever she needed something. She set her designer handbag on a stool, poured herself a cup of sparkling water, and sighed a long, theatrical sigh designed to invite sympathy. She leaned against the counter, projecting the image of a woman exhausted by the mundane burdens of managing a wealthy estate. I did not ask what was wrong. I knew better than to prompt her performance. I just kept typing, waiting for the inevitable transaction to unfold. Sylvia slid the black folder across the cool marble surface. It stopped right next to my textbook, a deliberate intrusion into my workspace. She smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners in a perfect imitation of maternal warmth. She told me it was just some routine tax paperwork. She waved her hand dismissively, framing the documents as boring administrative housekeeping that we needed to clear up before my birthday dinner. Her tone was light breezy and engineered to make the request seem entirely inconsequential. She said the accountants were updating the family trust files and needed my signature on a few standard revenue service forms to ensure my transition into adulthood went smoothly. To complete the presentation, she placed a heavy gold monogrammed pen directly on top of the folder. The metal gleamed under the pendant lights. She patted my shoulder, a brief and weightless touch telling me to just sign at the yellow sticky notes so she could mail them out before 5 o'clock. It was a masterful display of administrative cruelty, masking a life-altering theft behind the guise of a mundane chore. In our house, compliance was the default expectation. A good daughter would have picked up the gold pen, flipped to the yellow tabs, and scribbled her name without a second thought. But you do not hand unread contracts to a finance major. My occupational lens kicked in the moment the folder touched my desk. I view the world through risk assessment and liability, and my mother hovering expectantly over my shoulder triggered every internal alarm I possessed. I offered a polite nod, picked up the folder, and opened it. The first 2 pages were exactly what she claimed they were. They were standard Internal Revenue Service disclosure forms. Boilerplate language confirming my tax identification number and primary residence. They were harmless diversions. They were the camouflage. I turned to the 3rd page. My eyes scanned the dense blocks of legal text, skipping the broad introductory paragraphs and zeroing in on the fine print at the bottom of the sheet. This is where the true intent of any contract hides. My breath caught in my throat, though I forced my posture to remain perfectly relaxed. The document was not a tax disclosure. It was a custodial release authorization. The legal jargon was dense, but the meaning was terrifyingly clear. By signing the bottom line, I would be granting Richard Sterling the irrevocable power of attorney to list, negotiate, and sell the commercial real estate plaza in Reno. The clauses explicitly waived my right to contest any sale price and redirected the proceeds into a general family holding account controlled solely by my father. The paper in my hands was a loaded weapon aimed directly at my future. They were not asking me to update my files. They were asking me to hand over the keys to my entire inheritance, 2 weeks before I gained the legal authority to protect it. The betrayal was profound. A sharp physical ache blooming in the center of my chest. My parents were attempting to liquidate my legacy under the guise of a tax chore. A normal teenager might have thrown the folder back across the island. A normal daughter might have confronted her mother's screaming demands for the truth, crying over the realization that she was viewed as nothing more than a funding source. But I was not a normal daughter, and panic is a luxury I could not afford. I knew that showing any sign of comprehension would alert Sylvia to the failure of her plan. If they knew I understood the document, they would pivot from deceit to coercion. I had to secure the paperwork and get out of the room. I slowly closed the black folder, ensuring my hands did not tremble. I reached up and rubbed my temples with my fingertips, mimicking the onset of a familiar pain. I kept my voice soft and strained, apologizing to Sylvia. I told her the numbers on my spreadsheet were blurring, and that I felt a mild migraine coming on. Sylvia studied my face for a fraction of a second. I held her gaze, projecting nothing but dull, throbbing discomfort. The performance worked. The tension in her shoulders relaxed, replaced by a veneer of maternal concern that did not quite reach her eyes. She told me to go rest, advising me to take the folder to my room and sign the documents once the headache passed. It was exactly the permission I needed. I gathered my laptop, tucked the black folder securely against my chest, and left the gold pen sitting on the marble island. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway at a measured pace, resisting the overwhelming urge to run. Every step felt infinitely heavy, carrying the weight of a family bond that had just shattered into worthless dust. I reached my bedroom, stepped inside, and pushed the heavy wooden door shut. I engaged the brass lock with a quiet click. The moment the lock engaged, the carefully constructed facade I had maintained in the kitchen dissolved. The true horror of my situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. The air in my bedroom felt thin, cold, and unbreathable. I dropped my laptop onto the bed and stared at the sleek black folder in my hands. The physical reality of the document was nauseating. My own mother and father, the people charged with protecting my well-being, had conspired to trick me into signing away my financial security. They had paid an attorney to draft a mechanism of theft, polished it with a smile, and served it to me on a Tuesday afternoon. I sank onto the edge of my mattress, staring blankly at the wall, processing the sheer scale of their deceit. They did not just want to borrow against my asset. They wanted to consume it entirely, converting my grandparents' hard work into a temporary shield against their own ruin. For a long, agonizing moment, I let myself feel the grief. I mourned the parents I wished I had. I mourned the illusion of a safety net. I acknowledged the painful truth that in the Sterling household, love was entirely conditional on capital. But grief is a poor defensive strategy, and tears do not balance a ledger. I took a deep, steadying breath, forcing the emotional bleeding to stop. I mentally boxed up the sorrow, sealing it away behind a wall of cold logic. My emotional response became intentionally muted, replaced by a calculating clinical resolve. I was no longer a daughter reeling from a familial betrayal. I was an auditor who had just uncovered catastrophic corporate fraud, and it was time to initiate a thorough investigation. I walked over to my desk, opened the black folder one more time, and read every single word of the authorization. I needed to know exactly how deep the corruption ran, and I needed to know exactly how much time I had left to build my defense. The clock was ticking toward my birthday, and the fight for my survival had officially begun. The click of the deadbolt sliding into the strike plate marked the exact moment I stopped being a daughter. I walked across the plush carpet of my bedroom and sat at my desk, opening my laptop. The operating system chimed a cheerful sound that felt entirely disconnected from the reality settling over my shoulders. I did not open my finance textbook or my university lecture notes. I opened a blank spreadsheet and a web browser. I was no longer a student completing a homework assignment. I was an investigator auditing a hostile entity. My grandparents owned commercial real estate, which meant their assets were recorded in the public domain. You just had to know where to look. I navigated to the Washoe County Recorder website, the municipal database for the city of Reno. The interface was sterile and bureaucratic, a gray screen asking for an assessor parcel number or a registered name. I typed my own last name into the grantor search field. I pressed the return key and waited while the government server queried the ledger. The screen populated with a list of historical filings. Most of them were old utility easements and standard municipal tax assessments from when my grandfather managed the plaza. But at the very top of the list sat a new entry filed only 3 weeks prior. The document type was listed as a Memorandum of Purchase and Sale Agreement. My heart performed a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I paid the standard statutory fee using my debit card and downloaded the scanned PDF. The document loaded onto my screen, and the breadth of my father's deception laid itself bare in black and white. It was a binding commercial real estate contract. The buyer was listed as the Preston Group, a corporate acquisition firm known in my finance classes for their aggressive leveraged buyouts and ruthless negotiation tactics. The seller was listed as Richard Sterling, acting in his capacity as authorized custodian for Lorelei Sterling. I scrolled down to the signature page. There was my father's familiar sweeping signature executed in blue ink, legally binding my inheritance to a third party. I looked at the purchase price. It was a multi-million-dollar figure, negotiated far below the actual market value of a prime Reno commercial center. Richard had not tried to get a good deal. He had priced the property for a rapid liquidation. He needed the cash fast, and he was willing to leave millions on the table to secure an immediate buyer. Then I found the closing date. The contract stipulated that the final transfer of funds and the recording of the new deed would occur on a Tuesday. I pulled up my digital calendar and did the math. That Tuesday was exactly 48 hours after my 18th birthday. The timing was a masterclass in calculated cruelty. Under Nevada law, the custodial protections over the account evaporated the moment I came of age. Richard needed the release authorization signed today so he could submit it to the title company, securing his unilateral authority to disperse the funds before I even realized I had the legal right to stop him. He had orchestrated the entire transaction, assuming I would remain a compliant, uninformed child. I minimized the PDF and opened my blank spreadsheet. I labeled the first tab with a simple title: Liabilities. I needed to understand why a man who boasted about his venture capital success was holding a fire sale of his daughter's legacy. I opened a new tab in my browser and navigated to the Clark County Assessor Portal, the database for our home in Las Vegas. I ran a search on Richard and Sylvia Sterling. The results painted a picture of a corporation in the final stages of a terminal collapse. My father had a history of launching flashy investment funds that quietly folded within a few years, leaving traditional banks unwilling to extend him prime credit. The public records showed exactly how he had been funding our gated community lifestyle. I entered every recorded document into my spreadsheet, building a chronological map of their ruin. There was a secondary mortgage on our Las Vegas estate taken out 3 years ago, and currently carrying a variable interest rate that had recently adjusted upward. There were federal tax liens filed and subsequently released, indicating a chronic struggle to meet basic revenue obligations. But the most alarming discoveries were the recent promissory notes. In the past 6 months, Richard had executed 3 separate deeds of trust with private high-yield lending groups. These were not traditional bank loans. These were hard money bridge loans, the kind of capital secured by desperate borrowers facing immediate insolvency. The interest rates were predatory. I reviewed the collateral attachments listed on the public filings. Richard had pledged his primary residence, but the equity was already exhausted. He needed stronger collateral to secure the cash, keeping his illusion alive. I opened the Preston Group contract again and cross-referenced the dates with the hard money loans. The timeline snapped into focus with terrifying clarity. Richard had taken the impending sale of my Reno plaza to his private lenders. He had used the signed memorandum of agreement as proof of forthcoming liquidity. He had pledged the millions he intended to steal from me to secure the short-term cash he needed to pay for Harper's cheerleading camps, Sylvia's charity gala tables, and his own country club dues. The spreadsheet calculated the total debt. The red number at the bottom of the column exceeded the total proposed sale price of the Reno plaza. If the sale to the Preston Group did not close, my parents would not just bounce a few checks. They would face an existential financial obliteration. The hard money lenders would foreclose on our Las Vegas house within weeks. The country club would revoke their membership. But the civil ruin was only a fraction of the danger. By signing the bridge loan documents and pledging an asset, he did not hold the ultimate legal authority to sell. My father had crossed a critical line. He had misrepresented his custodial powers to secure financing. If the plaza sale failed, the lenders would audit his collateral. They would discover he had orchestrated a fraudulent transaction. My father was looking at wire fraud and federal banking violations. I sat back in my chair. The bedroom was silent save for the faint hum of the air conditioning vent above my bed. Outside my locked door, I could hear the faint sound of Sylvia laughing on the telephone in the hallway, chatting with a neighbor about a forthcoming charity auction. She sounded light and entirely unbothered. The blue light from my laptop screen illuminated my face in the darkened room. I stared at the red numbers on my spreadsheet and felt a profound, chilling stillness wash over me. This was not simply a case of greedy parents wanting a larger piece of the pie. This was a margin call. My father had leveraged his entire existence on a bet he could not cover, and he had designated me as his human shield. They had smiled at me over breakfast, asked about my university exams, and bought my favorite groceries, all while actively engineering a legal mechanism to strip me of my security and feed me to their creditors. They loved the wrought iron gates of our neighborhood. They loved the imported stone in our driveway. They loved the deference they received from the valet at the country club. They loved those things with a fierce, desperate devotion, and they loved them far more than they loved their eldest daughter. I did not shed a single tear. The betrayal was too vast for something as small as crying. My parents had built a trap designed to trigger the moment I became an adult, assuming my lifelong obedience would keep me blind to the mechanics. They believed they held all the leverage. They were wrong. I closed the county assessor portals and saved my spreadsheet. The investigation was over. It was time to build a defense. The morning sun crested over the artificial hills of our gated community, casting long shadows across the imported stone of our driveway. I did not go downstairs to join my mother for her morning routine of green juice and society gossip. I slipped out the side door, climbed into my sensible sedan, and bypassed the university campus entirely. I skipped my morning macroeconomics lecture, choosing instead to merge onto the highway, heading toward the brutalist architecture of downtown Las Vegas. The Strip is a neon playground where tourists arrive to surrender their wealth. Downtown, hidden behind the tinted windows of premium legal suites, is where the elite go to build fortresses around theirs. I drove in silence, the radio off my mind, running through the procedural steps of a hostile corporate defense. Valerie Quinn operated from a corner office on the 14th floor of a sleek, uninviting glass tower. She possessed the sharp, unblinking gaze of a predatory bird and wore a tailored charcoal suit that projected impenetrable authority. When I stepped into her suite, the receptionist did not treat me like an errant teenager asking for favors. She offered me sparkling water in a crystal glass and ushered me straight into the inner sanctum. Valerie did not offer a patronizing smile. She did not offer gentle reassurance. She was a former corporate litigator who had transitioned into high-net-worth asset protection, specializing in keeping hostile creditors at bay. She understood the language of survival, and she treated me as a serious client facing an imminent security breach. I sat across from her expansive mahogany desk and presented my findings. I laid out the printed county assessor records, the pending contract with the Preston Group, and the documentation of the hard money bridge loans my father had secured. Valerie reviewed the paperwork with clinical precision. Her eyes tracked the numbers, calculating the exact scope of my father's fraud. She noted the closing date scheduled for 2 days after my 18th birthday. She looked up from the documents, tapped her pen against the ledger, and confirmed my worst suspicions. Richard was attempting to close a fatal deficit using a bridge he did not legally own, banking entirely on my ignorance to finalize the transaction. We spent the next 2 hours drafting the counteroffensive. Nevada possesses a unique legal culture, famous for offering the most robust financial shielding laws in the country. Valerie proposed an ironclad Nevada Asset Protection Trust. She explained the mechanics of the structure with a cold, soothing logic. We would build a legal vault outfitting it with strict spendthrift provisions designed to repel any outside claims liens or custodial overrides. We established myself as the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. Valerie included specific clauses ensuring that no family member could intercept the transfer without triggering immediate legal sanctions. The strategy was a masterpiece of bureaucratic retaliation. The trust would be structured to activate upon a specific, unalterable triggering event. That event was the stroke of midnight on my 18th birthday. Valerie explained that the exact minute I became an adult, the custodial restrictions governing the Reno plaza would dissolve by operation of law. Simultaneously, our drafted provisions would automatically transfer the property deed directly into the new irrevocable trust. My father's custodial power of attorney would evaporate into thin air. The pending contract with the Preston Group would suddenly list a seller who possessed zero legal authority to convey the title. Any bridge loans secured against the plaza would instantly transform into unsecured toxic debt. Richard would be left holding a worthless signature on a voided contract. The trap was perfect in its silent execution. Valerie slid the preliminary drafting documents across the polished mahogany surface. She handed me a standard black rollerball pen. This was the defining moment. My hand hovered over the signature line on the engagement letter and the trust formation framework. Pressing the ink to the page felt heavier than any burden I had ever carried. It was the physical manifestation of severing my bloodline. By signing these documents, I was legally orphanizing my financial future. I was actively choosing to let my parents fall into the ruin they had dug for themselves. I thought about the heavy gold pen my father planned to hand me. I thought about the cheerful, predatory smiles they wore while plotting my ruin. I pressed the tip of the rollerball to the paper and signed my name. The ink flowed smooth and dark, an irreversible verdict that formalized my independence. Our strategy was set, leaving only the matter of her retainer. Valerie informed me of her fee, stating a number that would have made an average college student pale. I did not flinch. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, unmarked envelope. Inside sat tight stacks of $20 and $50 bills. For the past 2 years, I had spent my evenings tutoring failing fraternity members in corporate accounting and statistical modeling. I traded my intellect for their careless allowances, hoarding every dollar. I stashed the cash inside a hollowed-out textbook hidden in my closet, knowing I would eventually need a formidable escape fund. I slid the envelope across the desk and counted the bills onto the mahogany surface. $3,000 in crisp currency. Valerie watched the steady movement of my hands. She did not question the origin of the cash. She simply gathered the money, counted it a second time for accuracy, and drafted a formal receipt. Our business concluded, Valerie handed me a pristine manila folder containing the certified copies of our strategy. She looked me directly in the eye and advised me to return home, keep my head down, and keep smiling at the dinner table until the clock ran out. I thanked her, took the folder, and walked out of the suite. The elevator ride down to the lobby was silent, the hum of the machinery matching the steady rhythm of my heart. I stepped through the revolving glass doors and walked back out into the sweltering Nevada heat. The desert air burned my lungs, but my mind felt cool and pristine. I held the manila folder against my chest like a shield. I was no longer prey waiting to be consumed. I was the architect of their impending consequences. I drove back to the gated community, slipped past the manicured lawns, and hid the folder deep inside my desk drawer. The pieces were all in position. The architecture of my defense was flawless, waiting only for the sun to rise on my 18th birthday. The morning sun breached the edges of my blackout curtains, casting a sharp, unyielding line of light across the duvet. I opened my eyes and looked at the digital clock on my nightstand. It read 7 in the morning. I was 18 years old. I reached for my encrypted smartphone resting on the glass side table and opened my secure email client. A single message waited in the inbox sent by Valerie Quinn at exactly 6 seconds past midnight. Attached was a scanned PDF bearing a fresh digital recording stamp from the Washoe County clerk. The deed to the Reno commercial plaza had been formally and irrevocably conveyed into my Nevada Asset Protection Trust. The custodial chains were broken. I lay there for a moment listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioning wrapped in the profound, impenetrable armor of a perfected legal defense. I walked down the curved, carpeted staircase of our Las Vegas estate, my footsteps silent. The air on the ground floor smelled uncharacteristically sweet. Usually, mornings in our household were sterile-scented only by Sylvia brewing her strict lemon water and Richard barking into his headset regarding pre-market trading. Today, the rich aroma of dark roasted Kona coffee and warm, buttery baked goods filled the corridor. They had driven across town to a premium French patisserie, an errand they only ran when they needed to court a visiting investor. I stepped into the kitchen. The staging was immaculate. Sylvia stood by the marble island wearing a flowing silk robe, her hair perfectly blown out, arranging artisanal fruit tarts and almond croissants on a tiered porcelain stand. Richard sat at the head of the glass breakfast table dressed in a casual cashmere sweater that projected relaxed affluence. He was reading a financial newspaper, looking up with a bright manufactured smile the moment my shadow crossed the threshold. They were playing the roles of doting, celebratory parents with a theatrical enthusiasm that made my skin crawl. Sylvia glided across the kitchen, wrapping her arms around my shoulders in a brief, perfumed embrace. She poured coffee into a heated ceramic mug and slid it toward my usual seat, her voice dripping with artificial honey. She asked how it felt to finally be a legal adult, praising my poise at the country club dinner the previous night. She chattered about how proud they were, how bright my future looked, spinning a narrative of familial warmth that had never existed within these walls. I took my seat, accepting the coffee with a polite nod. Across the room, my younger sister Harper slouched in a suede dining chair, aggressively ignoring the performance. She stared at her phone screen, tapping out text messages with her thumbs, entirely disinterested in the elaborate trap our parents were laying. Her ignorance was a stark contrast to the suffocating tension pressing down on my chest. I knew exactly what was hiding beneath my father's casual posture and my mother's flawless smile. The silence beneath their chatter was deafening. They were preparing to spring the snare, unaware that the prey had already dismantled the trap. Richard folded his newspaper and set it aside, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the glass table, shifting seamlessly from the role of a loving father to the role of a senior managing partner. He cleared his throat, adopting a tone of respectful camaraderie. He told me that turning 18 was not just a personal milestone, but a professional one. He spoke about legacy, about the importance of generational wealth, and about how true prosperity is achieved through unified strategic action. He used phrases like portfolio synergy, asset consolidation, and fiduciary alignment. He was attempting to flatter my intelligence using the vocabulary of my university finance courses to lull me into a false sense of professional equity. Reaching into his leather briefcase resting on the floor beside him, he pulled out a pristine, unmarked manila folder. He placed it squarely on the glass table between us. I recognized the thickness of the paper inside. It was a fresh copy of the same custodial release document Sylvia had tried to slip past me 2 weeks prior. Richard tapped the cover of the folder with his index finger. He framed the document not as a surrender of my assets, but as an invitation to the adults' table. He proposed a family wealth management strategy, a joint venture, where we would pool our resources to maximize yields and conquer the local real estate market together. He claimed the paperwork was merely a formality, a simple authorization that would allow him to integrate my holdings into his broader, highly successful investment umbrella. He promised unprecedented returns, assuring me that under his guidance, my grandfather's cautious portfolio would multiply tenfold. Then came the defining gesture. Richard reached into his breast pocket and extracted a heavy, gold, monogrammed pen. The metal caught the morning sunlight streaming through the sheer kitchen curtains. He unscrewed the cap with a soft metallic scrape and placed the pen directly on top of the manila folder, the tip pointing toward my chair. He smiled a tight, eager expression that failed to reach his eyes and invited me to make my first executive decision. I looked at the folder, then at the gold pen, and finally up at my father. I did not reach for the ink. I did not flinch. I let a few seconds of heavy, deliberate silence stretch across the table, allowing the weight of his request to hang in the air. I offered him a pleasant, disarming smile. I kept my voice perfectly level, stripping all emotion from my delivery. I thanked him for the opportunity and expressed my appreciation for his willingness to collaborate. Then I initiated the stall tactic. I politely informed him that as a dedicated finance major, I had adopted a strict personal policy regarding legal contracts. I explained that I never sign any financial instrument, regardless of the counterparty, without first running the underlying figures through my own quantitative modeling software. I needed to perform a discounted cash flow analysis, review the proposed asset allocation, and stress test the portfolio models he was suggesting. I pushed the gold pen a fraction of an inch back toward his side of the table. I asked him to grant me 48 hours to review the terms and run my diagnostics before executing the signature. The reaction was instantaneous. The artificial warmth in the kitchen evaporated, replaced by a sudden glacial chill. Sylvia froze midway through, pouring a second cup of coffee, the glass carafe hovering rigidly over the mug. Richard's manufactured smile vanished, his facial muscles tightening into a rigid mask of barely contained panic. The shift was profound. The doting parents disappeared, revealing the desperate cornered predators lurking just beneath the surface. Richard stared at me, his jaw working silently as he processed the delay. His eyes darted toward the calendar pinned to the corkboard near the refrigerator, calculating the hours left before his fraudulent bridge loans imploded. He needed that signature today to satisfy the title company. A 48-hour delay pushed the timeline past the closing date of his secret sale to the Preston Group. He opened his mouth to argue the veneer of the collaborative mentor fracturing under the weight of his impending ruin. The Nevada sun beat down on the imported cobblestone of our circular driveway, baking the manicured hedges into a brittle, suffocating silence. I stood by the second-floor landing window, nursing a glass of iced tea, grateful for the heavy pane of glass blocking the oppressive afternoon heat. The house felt unusually still following the morning breakfast ambush. Then the silence fractured. A low, throaty engine roar echoed through the neighborhood security gates. The sound grew louder, reverberating off the stucco walls of the surrounding estates until a pristine sapphire blue sports car turned onto our property. The vehicle rolled to a smooth stop right in front of the main portico. A gigantic red velvet bow adorned the hood, catching the harsh desert sunlight and reflecting it in a blinding glare. The driver's side door swung open and Harper stepped out. My younger sister wore a designer tennis skirt and a cropped athletic top, holding her smartphone high in the air. She was recording a live video broadcast for her sprawling audience of social media followers. Her voice pierced the thick glass of my window, shrill and breathless with performative excitement. She shrieked about her early Sweet 16 present posing next to the aerodynamic curves of the vehicle, with a practiced hollow grin. She blew kisses to her digital audience, draped herself over the pristine paint job, and narrated every single detail of the custom white leather interior. I rested my forehead against the cool window pane, watching the display of extreme extravagance. My brain did not register the shiny exterior or the velvet bow. My brain registered the sticker price. A European import with those specific trim features retailed for $95,000. Once you factor in the inevitable dealer markups, the exorbitant luxury vehicle taxes, and the expedited delivery fees, the total easily cleared 6 figures. I stepped back from the glass and let the heavy curtains fall shut. The arithmetic was immediate and unforgiving. I knew my father held a credit score hovering near subprime levels due to his chronic missed mortgage payments and overextended platinum credit cards. No traditional dealership finance department would ever approve a 6-figure loan for a man with his debt ratio. Furthermore, he lacked the liquid cash in his checking accounts to buy the vehicle outright. There was only one financial mechanism capable of funding that extravagant purchase on such short notice. Richard had secured another hard money advance. He had returned to his predatory private lender's paperwork in hand, boasting about the imminent closing of the Reno commercial plaza. He had used the forged promise of my inheritance to extract a quick cash infusion. The sheer audacity of the purchase settled in my chest like a dense block of ice. They were not just stealing from me to survive a looming foreclosure. They were stealing from me to fund a frivolous vanity project. They were willing to liquidate my grandparents' decades of hard work so a teenager could brag to strangers on the internet. They were spending my stolen future before the ink on his fraudulent contract even had a chance to dry. I walked down the sweeping carpeted staircase and stepped out through the heavy mahogany front doors. The dry heat hit my skin instantly, a physical wall of temperature that matched the stifling nature of my family. Harper was still circling the vehicle, snapping photos from different angles to ensure the mansion was visible in the background. She barely glanced in my direction as I approached the cobblestone driveway. I kept my hands tucked neatly into the pockets of my cardigan. I asked her when the dealership had delivered the car. Harper did not bother to look up from her screen. She swiped a filter across her latest photo and scoffed a short sound of profound irritation. She told me the delivery service had dropped it off 10 minutes ago. She finally turned to face me, her eyes sweeping over my plain clothes with an expression of profound pity. She leaned against the driver's side door, twirling the expensive key fob around her index finger. "Daddy said our investments finally paid off," Harper said, her tone dripping with unearned superiority. "He said it is time we started enjoying the wealth instead of hoarding it like a bunch of nervous accountants. You should ask him for a shopping spree. You look like you buy your clothes at a discount warehouse." She weaponized the impending theft of my own legacy to insult my frugality. She stood there basking in the artificial glow of stolen money, entirely oblivious to the precarious financial cliff her parents had driven her toward. She was a living liability draped in sapphire paint and velvet ribbon. She believed the lies Richard fed her because the lies funded her lifestyle. I did not feel a sudden spike of anger. I did not feel the urge to slap the phone out of her hand or scream the truth into her face. The agonizing betrayal I had felt earlier that morning simply evaporated. It was replaced by a profound clinical stillness. The final threads of familial loyalty frayed and snapped, drifting away on the hot desert wind. I looked at my younger sister, then at the sprawling stucco mansion behind her, and finally at the ridiculous red bow sitting on the hood of the sports car. I stopped seeing them as a family in need of rescue. I stopped viewing Richard and Sylvia as parents who had lost their way. I recategorized every person residing on this property. They were hostile creditors. They were bad actors in a fraudulent enterprise, and they were actively trying to strip mine my resources to fund their unending vanity. A sharp, calculating calm washed over my mind. The emotional bleeding stopped. An auditor does not weep over a falsified balance sheet. An auditor reviews the discrepancies, finalizes the report, and delivers the catastrophic finding without flinching. My parents had spent my entire life teaching me that affection was a transactional exchange. They had shown me that love required a positive balance, and they had just overdrawn their account permanently. I would not allow them to drag my pristine credit into their bankruptcy. I smiled at Harper. It was a flawless, empty smile. I told her the car was a perfect fit for her personality and wished her luck driving it on the local roads. I turned around and walked back into the air-conditioned chill of the house. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind me, sealing out the noise of her social media broadcast and the blinding glare of the afternoon sun. I walked back up the sweeping staircase, the thick carpet silencing my footsteps. I returned to my bedroom and locked the door, finding sanctuary at my desk. I opened my laptop and pulled up the financial spreadsheet I had built the day before. I added a new row for the luxury sports car, estimating the monthly payments, the insurance premiums for a teenage driver, and the exorbitant interest rate of the hard money loan that funded it. The red numbers at the bottom of the column grew larger, representing a deficit that no amount of country club posturing could ever erase. My father was building a house of cards in a hurricane, and he had expected me to serve as the foundation. I closed the spreadsheet and opened the encrypted application that held my trust documents. The Nevada state seal stared back at me, a digital promise of impenetrable security. The transfer was complete. The title was clean. I had legally orphaned my wealth, and I felt nothing but profound, exquisite relief. Let them drive the sports car. Let them boast to their friends. The bill was coming due, and my name was no longer on the account. I walked into my adjoining bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. The 48-hour window I had demanded was already ticking down, counting the minutes until their fraudulent scheme collided with my legal reality. The artificial peace of our household was fracturing rapidly, and the desperate predators were beginning to circle. I dried my face with a towel and looked at my reflection in the mirror. My mind was clear. My assets were secured. I was ready for the collections department to call. The ticking clock is a tangible entity in a house built on borrowed time. By Thursday evening, the 48-hour review window I had requested was evaporating into the arid desert air, and the temperature inside our stucco fortress dropped accordingly. The performative sweetness of the birthday breakfast had curdled into a suffocating, frantic tension. My parents were no longer pretending to celebrate my transition into adulthood. They were waiting for a payout, and their patience was entirely exhausted. I sat on the white leather sofa in the formal living room, a space designed exclusively for hosting charity committees, and rarely used for actual living. The room was a monument to their curated facade filled with abstract sculptures and imported glass tables that held no personal history. My laptop rested on my knees. I was staring at a blank spreadsheet, though my fingers tapped the keyboard at random intervals to maintain the illusion of deep academic focus. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a pristine view of the darkening Nevada sky, mirroring the impending confrontation. Sylvia marched into the room. She did not glide this time. Her footsteps were heavy, purposeful, and devoid of her usual curated grace. She wore a tailored silk blouse and sharp trousers, her hair pulled back into a severe knot at the nape of her neck. The loving mother facade was gone, discarded the moment it failed to yield a signature on the dotted line. She stood over me, casting a long, sharp shadow across my screen. She demanded to know why I was choosing to be so difficult and selfish over a simple piece of paper. Her voice lacked its usual melodic lilt. It was flat, brittle, and edged with genuine hostility. She crossed her arms, pacing the length of the Persian rug, and launched into a meticulously calculated monologue. Sylvia did not speak of love, maternal worry, or familial bonds. She spoke of invoices. She listed every sacrifice they had allegedly made to cultivate my upbringing, treating my childhood like a bad investment she was trying to recoup. She itemized the tuition checks written to my elite private preparatory academy, ignoring the fact that I had secured my own academic scholarships to offset the costs. She referenced the designer clothes purchased to ensure I matched the family aesthetic during holiday card photo shoots. She brought up the exorbitant cost of maintaining our gated estate, framing the roof over my head as a luxury service I had been consuming for free over the past 18 years. She even listed the private tennis lessons I was forced to take at the country club, spinning her own social ambitions as a generous gift bestowed upon an ungrateful child. According to her revised narrative, the Reno commercial plaza was never my inheritance. It was a misplaced asset that disrupted the natural flow of our household economy. She attempted to reframe the theft of my grandparents' hard work as a routine settling of accounts. She told me that handing over the deed was simply my way of paying back what I owed the family ledger. It was a required dividend for years of premium care. I listened to her speech, parsing her words through my occupational lens. It was a fascinating display of emotional extortion built on a foundation of sunk-cost fallacies. They had chosen to spend beyond their means to project status to their neighbors, and now they wanted to retroactively bill me for the props used in their performance. I closed my laptop with a soft click. I looked up at her, keeping my posture relaxed and my expression entirely neutral. I maintained my clinical polite boundaries. I informed her that I was still reviewing the clauses of the custodial release and evaluating the long-term tax implications of the proposed asset transfer. Sylvia let out a sharp, exasperated breath, her eyes narrowing as she prepared to launch a second wave of verbal artillery. But before she could speak, Richard stepped into the living room from the hallway. My father did not bother with pleasantries. He bypassed the maternal guilt trip and proceeded directly to authoritarian coercion. He stood beside my mother, his face flushed a deep mottled red, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. The bespoke tailoring of his blazer could not hide the rigid, vibrating tension radiating from his frame. He pointed a finger at me, issuing a direct, unequivocal threat. He told me that this game of financial modeling was over. He dictated his terms with ruthless clarity. If I did not sign the release authorization by Friday evening, I would face immediate and total excommunication from the Sterling enterprise. He threatened to contact the university registrar the next morning to cancel my tuition payments. He promised to sever my health insurance coverage before the weekend began. Finally, he stated that if the paper lacked my signature by dinner time, he would pack my bags himself, change the security codes on the front gate, and evict me from the house. He presented these ultimatums as a display of immense patriarchal power. He expected me to crumble to weep, to beg for my place within the safety of our gated community to be restored. He expected the threat of sudden poverty to force my immediate compliance. This was a defining moment, a crucial piece of data in the audit of their deceit. I watched my father carefully. I did not focus on the volume of his threats. I focused on the specific strained pitch of his voice. I watched the erratic pulse beating against his collar. I noted the faint sheen of sweat gathering at his temples despite the chilled air conditioning humming through the vents. My father was not projecting authority. He was projecting terror. I recognized the exact frequency of his tone. It was the frantic, breathless sound of a day trader watching a chart plummet, realizing a catastrophic margin call is mere seconds away. He was not threatening me because he held all the power. He was threatening me because he had leveraged his entire existence on a bluff, and the lenders were standing at his door. The buyers needed their clear title, and the hard money lenders needed their collateral. If he did not deliver my signature by Friday evening, his carefully constructed fraud would collapse, and he was going to prison. I did not scream in protest. I did not shed a single tear over the sudden erasure of my familial safety net. I experienced a profound sense of clarity. Their extortion tactics relied entirely on the assumption that I needed their financial support to survive. They did not realize that I had already secured my own fortress. My Nevada Asset Protection Trust held millions of dollars in income-generating commercial real estate. The monthly lease payments from the Reno pharmacy and the grocery store were already being legally routed into a newly established corporate account under my sole control. I could pay my own university tuition in cash tomorrow morning. I could purchase premium health insurance without glancing at the monthly premiums. I could rent a luxury penthouse overlooking the Las Vegas Strip if I desired. Their threats were financially impotent. They were attempting to leverage an overdrawn checking account against a fully funded bank. I looked at my father, absorbing the full weight of his desperation. I did not argue. I offered a simple, slow nod. I accepted the terms of their extortion with the calm grace of a negotiator who already holds the winning hand. I told him I understood his position perfectly, and I promised we would finalize the matter at our scheduled dinner on Friday evening. Richard exhaled a shaky breath, his shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch. He believed he had won. He believed his brutal display of force had successfully terrified his teenage daughter into submission. He turned and walked out of the room, Sylvia following closely behind him, leaving me alone in the sterile luxury of the living room. I sat in the silence, tracing the smooth aluminum edge of my laptop. The deadline was set. The social trap was being laid for Friday night, and the final collection notice was ready to be served. The house felt less like a residential estate, and more like the trading floor of a bankrupt firm. Friday morning arrived with a frantic, suffocating energy that seeped through the drywall and poisoned the air. The Preston Group was not a collection of patient local investors willing to wait for a delayed signature. They were a syndicated commercial real estate firm based out of Chicago. They built their portfolio by targeting undervalued retail centers and executing ruthless, rapid acquisitions. They had placed millions of dollars into a corporate escrow account, and their legal team was demanding a clear, unencumbered title to finalize the transfer of the Reno plaza. The closing date was looming over the weekend, and the friction generated by the delay was producing visible sparks. My father paced the length of the downstairs hallway, his leather loafers slapping against the hardwood floor. The polished country club patriarch had vanished overnight. He was replaced by a man coming undone at the seams. His usually crisp dress shirt was wrinkled, the top 2 buttons undone, and a dark shadow of stubble covered his jawline. He held his cellular phone tight against his ear, his voice alternating between forced joviality and breathless pleading. The calls came in rapid succession. I watched him from the top of the sweeping staircase hidden in the shadows of the second-floor landing. He looked exactly like the architect of a Ponzi scheme who had run out of new investors to pay the old ones. He was juggling hard money lenders, title officers, and angry brokers. Each phone call was a spinning plate, and the wooden poles supporting them were beginning to snap. I could hear snippets of his desperate lies echoing up the stairs. He promised that the paperwork was simply held up in a minor underwriting review. He swore that the funds were guaranteed and requested just a few more hours of grace. His entire reality depended on securing my signature before the sun went down. I walked down the stairs and headed to the kitchen to pour myself a glass of iced water. Sylvia was absent. She was likely hiding in her master suite with the door locked to avoid the toxic atmosphere filling the corridors. Harper was still asleep, dreaming of her new sports car, oblivious to the fact that her luxury lifestyle was evaporating by the minute. As I stood by the stainless steel refrigerator, the home landline began to ring. We rarely used the landline. It was a relic, a number given only to banks, utility companies, and debt collectors. The phone rang 4 loud, shrill times before the answering machine engaged. The digital speaker clicked on, broadcasting a harsh voice across the quiet kitchen. The man on the other end of the line did not bother with pleasantries or formal introductions. He identified himself as a senior underwriter for a private equity lending group located in Scottsdale. His tone was furious and clipped. It was the distinct voice of a creditor who realized his expensive collateral was built on quicksand. He stated that the bridge loan advance tied to the recent purchase of the imported sports car was now in default of its primary covenant agreements. He demanded immediate contact from Richard Sterling. The underwriter warned that failure to provide proof of clear title for the Reno commercial plaza by the close of business would result in an immediate acceleration of the loan. He demanded the principal balance returned in full by Monday morning. He closed the message by mentioning the distinct possibility of contacting federal authorities regarding wire fraud and the deliberate misrepresentation of assets. The machine beeped, and the kitchen fell silent once more. I listened to the recording click off, feeling the gravity of the situation settle into the room. The stakes were no longer theoretical or confined to social embarrassment. Richard was not merely going to lose face among his wealthy neighbors at the golf course. He was facing imminent bankruptcy and a very real threat of criminal prosecution. He had signed legal documents pledging a commercial property he did not legally own. He had accepted cash advances across state lines based on those forged promises. The federal government does not take kindly to men who use their children as fraudulent collateral to secure unregulated loans. My father was trapped in a cage of his own making, and the iron bars were closing in fast. I left the kitchen and returned to the quiet sanctuary of my bedroom. I locked the heavy wooden doors, shutting out the noise of my father pacing in the hallway. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, pulling up the master financial spreadsheet I had maintained for weeks. I needed to run one final calculation to understand the exact depth of the crater my parents had dug. I entered the principal amounts of the bridge loans, the penalty interest rates, the outstanding mortgage balances on our Las Vegas estate, and the staggering credit card deficits. I factored in the luxury vehicle taxes, the overdue country club initiation fees, and the unpaid landscaping contracts. I meticulously calculated the exact dollar amount my family was about to default on. The final red number at the bottom of the column was breathtaking. It represented a debt so deep that they would spend the rest of their natural lives trying to climb out of it. I stared at the glowing screen and felt a brief, fleeting moment of pity wash over me. It was a strange, hollow sensation. I did not pity their impending poverty. I did not pity the severe legal consequences they were about to face. I pitied how thoroughly they had chained their entire self-worth to a lifestyle they could never afford. Richard had grown up in a working-class neighborhood, wearing second-hand clothes and nursing a deep, unspoken insecurity about his origins. He had spent his entire adult life trying to purchase a wealthy identity that would erase his past. Sylvia had traded her own ambitions for a prestigious zip code, measuring her human value by the brand of car she drove and the exclusive parties she attended. They had built a hollow, fragile religion out of status, and they were willing to sacrifice their eldest daughter on its altar to keep the congregation from leaving. It was a pathetic, empty way to live. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk and retrieved the pristine manila folder containing my trust documents. I opened the heavy cover and ran my fingers over the crisp, watermarked paper. I traced the raised seal of the Nevada Notary Public. I reviewed the clauses drafted by Valerie Quinn, confirming one last time that the title to the Reno Plaza was irrevocably shielded within my newly formed asset protection trust. The contrast between my reality and my father's reality was profound. Richard was downstairs sweating, lying, and pacing in a chaotic frenzy of crumbling fraud. He was fighting a desperate war he had already lost weeks ago. I was sitting in a quiet, climate-controlled room holding a flawless piece of legal architecture. My defense required no shouting. It required no deception. It relied entirely on the cold, dispassionate enforcement of state law. A deep sense of satisfaction settled into my bones. The frantic energy of the house could not touch me. My ledger was balanced. I closed the folder and placed it back into the drawer, turning the small brass key to lock it. The country club dinner was scheduled for that evening. The social trap was primed and the corporate audience was gathering. But before I delivered the final blow in front of his buyers, I needed to test him one last time. I needed to look him in the eye, present him with a fraction of the truth, and see if a single shred of honesty remained in his conscience. I stood up from my desk, smoothed the front of my shirt, and walked toward the bedroom door. The hallway leading to my father's home office felt longer than usual. The thick carpeting absorbed the sound of my footsteps, allowing me to approach his sanctuary undetected. The heavy oak door was slightly ajar, a rare occurrence that spoke volumes about his current state of mind. Richard Sterling viewed his office as a fortress of corporate authority. The room was decorated to project an image of old money and unshakable stability. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves held leather-bound volumes he had never opened. A large humidor hummed quietly in the corner, resting on a credenza beside framed magazine articles that praised his early fleeting successes in venture capital. I paused just outside the doorframe, observing him through the narrow opening. He was seated at his expansive desk, bathed in the harsh glow of dual computer monitors. He did not look like a titan of industry. He looked like a cornered animal. His suit jacket was discarded over the back of a leather chair. His tie hung loose around his neck, and the sleeves of his expensive dress shirt were rolled up to his elbows. He was hunched over a printed ledger, holding a pen in a white-knuckled grip. A faint sheen of sweat coated his forehead, catching the light from his desk lamp. His leg bounced in a frantic, nervous rhythm, causing the heavy desk to vibrate subtly. I watched him scribble a number, cross it out, and drag both hands down his face. The physical toll of the impending default was undeniable. The crushing weight of the bridge loans, the furious demands from the underwriters, and the looming threat of federal fraud charges were dismantling him from the inside out. I pushed the heavy oak door open. The brass hinges swung silently, but the shift in air pressure caused him to jump. He slammed his ledger shut with a loud, sudden clap, his eyes darting toward the entryway. The guilt was written into every line of his posture. He scrambled to sit upright hurriedly, adjusting his collar and attempting to arrange his features into a mask of paternal annoyance. "Lorelei," he said, his voice cracking slightly before he found his usual booming resonance. "You should knock. I am in the middle of a very delicate negotiation." I stepped onto the intricate pattern of the Persian rug and stopped in the center of the room. I kept my hands folded neatly in front of me. I did not project anger or fear. I projected the cold, dispassionate energy of a compliance auditor conducting a surprise review. "I apologize for the intrusion," I said, keeping my tone perfectly even. "I just wanted to ask a quick question regarding the custodial release forms you gave me." I am having trouble reconciling a few variables, and I thought you might clarify them. Richard forced a stiff smile, waving his hand in a dismissive gesture. I told you it is standard housekeeping. There is nothing to reconcile. You are overthinking a basic tax protocol. I held his gaze, refusing to let him break the eye contact. I was just curious how the underwriting process is proceeding with the Preston Group, I said. And I was wondering if the accelerated demands on your hard money bridge loan out of Scottsdale are going to impact the closing timeline for the Reno plaza. The silence that followed was suffocating. The air in the office seemed to freeze. I watched the blood drain from my father's face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. His jaw slackened, and the manufactured confidence vanished entirely. His hands resting on top of the closed ledger began to tremble. For a long, agonizing moment, he simply stared at me, his mind desperately trying to calculate how a naive college freshman had uncovered the highly classified architecture of his criminal fraud. I gave him the space to confess. I stood perfectly still, offering him a silent off-ramp. This was his final opportunity to act like a father. He could have broken down, admitted he was drowning in debt, and begged for my forgiveness. He could have treated me like a human being instead of a financial instrument. I waited to see if a single shred of integrity remained in his conscience. He chose the lie. The shock on his face morphed into a defensive, territorial fury. The color rushed back into his cheeks, shifting from gray to a mottled, angry crimson. He stood up from his leather chair, planting both hands firmly on the mahogany desktop, puffing out his chest to project physical intimidation. "How dare you!" he hissed, his voice trembling with manufactured outrage. "Why are you invading my private corporate workspace? Why are you digging into matters that do not concern you?" He walked around the desk, closing the distance between us. He loomed over me, attempting to use his height to force my submission. "You think you understand the world because you took a few undergraduate finance courses," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You know nothing about complex high-level finance. You are playing with concepts far beyond your comprehension." I did not step back. I maintained my ground, offering no physical reaction to his posturing. "I understand that you signed a purchase agreement for a commercial asset you do not legally own," I replied, my voice steady. "I understand that you pledged my inheritance as collateral to secure short-term cash for yourself." Richard pointed a trembling finger at my face. He launched into a staggering performance of deception, attempting to gaslight me into doubting my own reality. He insisted that the sale to the Preston Group was orchestrated entirely for my own good. He claimed that the custodial trust structure my grandparents had established was legally defective and vulnerable to severe federal tax penalties. He spun a frantic narrative where he was the unsung savior of my future, working tirelessly behind the scenes to rescue my assets before the government seized them. "I am trying to protect you," he stated, his voice rising in volume. "Your grandparents were fools who tied up valuable equity in a stagnant market. I am liquidating that liability to roll the capital into a diversified high-yield portfolio. I am building a legacy for this family, and you are acting like an ungrateful, paranoid child." He paced the floor, running a hand through his thinning hair. He painted the theft of my property as a protective measure, an act of paternal devotion that I was simply too inexperienced to appreciate. He stopped pacing and turned back to face me, attempting to regain his polished composure. He straightened his tie and smoothed the lapels of his shirt. He decided it was time to issue the final mandate. "The time for playing amateur accountant is over," he commanded. "I have arranged a special dinner at the country club for this evening. Important associates will be joining us to finalize this transition. You will wear a nice dress. You will show up on time. You will bring the folder and my gold pen, and you will sign the release authorization without causing an embarrassing scene." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice to a harsh whisper. "You will act like a loyal daughter, Lorelei. You will sign the paper, or you will find out exactly how difficult life can be when you no longer have my protection." I listened to every single word he spoke. I observed the frantic darting of his eyes and the rigid tension in his jaw. I identified the exact fraction of a second where my final shred of familial loyalty expired. It was a clean, painless death. The father I had spent my childhood trying to please did not exist. The man standing before me was simply a hostile debtor, attempting to negotiate a fraudulent settlement through coercion and deceit. He was a liability, and it was time to write him off the ledger. My occupational detachment solidified, forming an impenetrable shield around my emotions. I did not point out the glaring flaws in his legal theories. I did not mention the severe criminal penalties for banking fraud. I simply looked him in the eye and offered a serene, accommodating nod. "I understand your position perfectly," I said, my voice eerily calm and compliant. "I appreciate you taking the time to explain the complexity of the situation. I will attend the dinner tonight, and we can finalize the paperwork." Richard exhaled a long, shuddering breath. The rigid tension melted from his frame and his shoulders slumped in profound relief. A genuine smile broke across his face, the smile of a desperate gambler who believes his bluff has just won the pot. He thought his authoritarian bluster had successfully bullied his 18-year-old daughter into total submission. He believed the crisis was averted, and his country club status was secure. He patted my shoulder, a hollow gesture of victory, and told me he knew I would make the right choice. He turned back toward his desk, already planning his celebratory drinks. He had no idea he had just scheduled his own financial execution. The Friday evening air in Las Vegas carried a residual baking heat that settled over the pristine asphalt of the country club parking lot. I handed my car keys to a valet who wore a crisp white polo shirt, stepping out of my sedan into the orchestrated luxury of my parents' chosen arena. The club architecture borrowed heavily from European estates, featuring soaring stucco archways, imported clay tile roofs, and ornate fountains that cycled thousands of gallons of water into the dry desert atmosphere, simply to prove they could afford the evaporation. I wore a tailored navy sheath dress, selecting a garment that projected professional competence rather than youthful celebration. I walked through the heavy glass double doors, greeted immediately by the scent of fresh floral arrangements and the muted, expensive hum of polite conversation. A hostess guided me toward a private dining alcove set apart from the main floor by frosted glass partitions. Through the translucent barriers, I could see the familiar silhouettes of my family. I also saw 2 extra figures seated at the table. The trap was engineered to utilize high society etiquette as a cage. In the world my parents inhabited, causing a public disturbance was a cardinal sin. You could face bankruptcy, harbor profound resentments, or despise your own blood provided you maintained a pleasant volume while dining among your peers. Richard and Sylvia were relying on that unwritten social contract to secure my compliance. They assumed I would rather sign away my inheritance than endure the crushing embarrassment of a public confrontation. I stepped around the frosted partition and took my place at the circular table. My father stood immediately beaming with a forced, radiant pride that did not reach the tight corners of his eyes. He rested a heavy hand on my shoulder, steering me toward the empty, leather-upholstered chair next to him. Across the table, flanked by untouched crystal water goblets and heavy silver cutlery, sat 2 men I had never met. They wore bespoke, tailored suits that projected a quiet, lethal authority. They possessed the polished, predatory calm of individuals who dismantled struggling corporations for a living. These were the senior acquisition officers from the Preston Group, the Chicago-based firm waiting to absorb my Reno commercial plaza. Richard cleared his throat, commanding the attention of the alcove. He introduced me to the executives, pitching his voice to carry just far enough to impress the neighboring tables without appearing crass. He described me as his brilliant, business-minded daughter spinning a fabricated narrative where I was an eager apprentice ready to finalize a lucrative joint venture, alongside my seasoned father. He painted our fraudulent transaction as a heartwarming generational torch-passing ceremony. The older executive, a man with silver hair and a sharp assessing gaze, extended his hand across the white linen. I shook it, noting the firm, dismissive pressure of his grip. He viewed me not as a property owner or a formidable negotiator, but as a naive teenager rubber-stamping her father's brilliant deal. Sylvia sat directly across from me, sipping sparkling water with rigid, flawless posture. She wore an emerald green cocktail dress, projecting the image of a serene and supportive matriarch. Yet her knuckles were white where she gripped her linen napkin in her lap, and her eyes darted nervously between the Chicago executives and my empty hands. She was a woman watching a short fuse burn down to the wire, praying the explosion would somehow happen out of sight. Harper slouched in the chair beside our mother, wearing an expression of profound theatrical boredom. My younger sister tapped her manicured nails against the table edge, scrolling endlessly through her social media feeds. She occasionally offered a mocking smirk in my direction, entirely unaware that the luxury sports car she currently boasted about online was parked on a financial fault line currently fracturing beneath her feet. She was emblematic of the delusion they were all fighting to protect. A waiter in a dark tailored vest approached the table carrying a bottle of premium vintage champagne, resting in a condensation-beaded silver ice bucket. He moved with practiced invisibility, pouring the pale, bubbling liquid into 6 crystal flutes. The sound of the effervescence filled the quiet, tense spaces in the conversation. Richard raised his glass, initiating a toast to new partnerships, expanding horizons, and family success. The executives chuckled warmly, raising their own flutes in a gesture of corporate solidarity. I lifted my glass to maintain the choreography of the moment, but I did not let the champagne touch my lips. The stakes were too high, and my mind required razor-sharp clarity. As the waiter retreated to the shadows of the alcove, Richard shifted his posture. The waiting period had expired. The conversational pleasantries evaporated, replaced by the cold mechanical reality of a closing deal. My father reached into the interior breast pocket of his blazer. He extracted the familiar manila folder, placing it squarely on the center of the heavy linen tablecloth. He opened the cover, revealing the pristine custodial release authorization I had avoided signing 3 days prior. The yellow adhesive tabs still marked the signature lines, glowing brightly under the ambient lighting of the chandelier above us. Richard reached into his other pocket and retrieved his heavy gold monogrammed pen. He placed the pen directly on top of the contract. With a smooth, deliberate motion, he slid the entire arrangement across the tablecloth until it stopped directly in front of my empty dinner plate. He looked up at the Preston Group executives, his smile stretched so tight it looked physically painful. He announced that his daughter was thrilled to complete the transfer, framing my impending signature as the final triumphant step in our shared wealth management strategy. He then turned his gaze to me. His eyes held a desperate, suffocating plea mixed with a rigid, unspoken threat. He was begging me to save his life while simultaneously daring me to humiliate him in front of his wealthy peers and business associates. The dining alcove went still. The executives watched me with mild, polite interest, expecting a quick scribble of ink so they could proceed to ordering their prime steaks. Sylvia held her breath, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the light as she gripped the edge of the table. Harper finally looked up from her glowing phone screen, sensing the sudden drastic shift in the atmospheric pressure of the room. I did not reach for the pen. I did not avert my gaze. I sat back in my chair, folding my hands neatly in my lap. I observed the scene with the cold, detached precision of an auditor examining a fraudulent tax return. I looked at the crisp white paper, the gold instrument of my financial execution, and the terrified, sweating man trying to force my hand. The tension in the dining room swelled thick and palpable, pressing against the frosted glass partitions as the assembled audience waited for my move. The ambient noise of the country club dining room faded into a muted, rushing hum, a stark contrast to the thundering pulse echoing in my ears. Waiters drifted past our frosted glass partition carrying trays of seared scallops and truffle risotto, oblivious to the high-stakes corporate execution pending at table 4. The scent of roasted garlic and expensive floral centerpieces mingled in the chilled air. Richard leaned forward, the fabric of his bespoke blazer pulling taut across his shoulders. A single drop of perspiration charted a slow course down his temple, catching the amber light of the chandelier. He nudged the heavy gold pen another fraction of an inch toward my porcelain plate. The metallic scrape sounded like a gavel falling in a quiet courtroom. The 2 executives from Chicago observed me with practiced patience, sipping their sparkling water. They were accustomed to these closing rituals, viewing my signature as a mere administrative formality, a brief chore to complete before the vintage champagne could be properly consumed. Sylvia sat rigid beside me, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the pristine white linen napkin on her lap. Her eyes pleaded with me to maintain the illusion, projecting a desperate, silent demand for obedience. Harper continued to stare at her glowing screen, typing rapid messages entirely disconnected from the adults navigating the silent war zone. I looked at the gold pen. I did not reach for the polished metal. I did not move a single muscle to validate my father's desperate staging. I let the silence stretch, forcing the discomfort to pool around Richard's ankles like rising floodwater. The immense social pressure was designed to crush a compliant daughter into rapid submission. They assumed the fear of causing a public scene would override my basic instinct for self-preservation. But they were not dealing with a compliant daughter. They were dealing with a finance student who treated family loyalty as a liability on a balance sheet, and I had already finished grading their ledger. When the silence became unbearable, Richard cleared his throat, attempting to project a jovial encouragement that landed flat and brittle. He urged me to go ahead and initial the yellow adhesive tabs. He promised we would order the prime rib the moment the paperwork was secured in his leather briefcase, spinning a narrative of celebratory partnership. I kept my hands resting calmly in my lap. I looked directly into his panicked, bloodshot eyes, holding his gaze until the manufactured warmth drained entirely from his face, leaving behind a hollow, terrified core. "I will not be signing that," I stated. My voice was even pitched at a conversational volume that did not invite debate or negotiation. Sylvia gasped, a sharp intake of breath that sounded like tearing silk in the quiet alcove. Richard recoiled, blinking rapidly, his mouth opening and closing without producing a sound. He looked around the table, terrified that the executives had witnessed the glitch in his flawless presentation. He leaned in, closing the distance between us, lowering his voice to a harsh, commanding whisper. He ordered me to stop playing childish games and sign the document immediately, his tone laced with a venomous urgency. I ignored his directive. I unclasped the brass lock of my leather tote bag resting on the floor beside my chair. I reached inside and withdrew a plain, unmarked manila folder. It lacked the glossy, expensive finish of my father's presentation materials. It was simple, bureaucratic, and lethal. I lifted my folder and placed it squarely on top of Richard's contract, covering his fraudulent release authorization and pushing his golden instrument aside. The heavy pen rolled off the paperwork and clattered uselessly against the base of my crystal water goblet. I opened the cover of my folder. Inside rested a stack of thick watermarked legal paper bound by a heavy brass staple and embossed with the raised seal of the Nevada Secretary of State. I did not slide the documents toward my father. He was no longer the principal counterparty in this transaction. I slid the certified pages across the white linen tablecloth, directing them straight to the lead acquisition officer from the Preston Group. The silver-haired executive frowned, looking down at the unexpected paperwork invading his table space. He picked up the heavy packet, adjusting his reading glasses, his corporate instincts sensing a sudden, profound shift in the terrain. As a finance student, I prefer strict compliance regarding asset transfers. I explained, addressing the executives with the clinical detachment of a board member presenting quarterly losses. I understand my father has been negotiating a purchase agreement with your firm. Unfortunately, the Reno commercial plaza cannot be sold to you, nor to anyone else. Richard slammed his open palm against the table, rattling the silver cutlery. He tried to interrupt sputtering, rapid, incoherent apologies to the buyers, claiming I was a confused teenager prone to dramatic hormonal outbursts. He reached across the table to snatch my documents away, frantic to hide the evidence of his fraud. The lead executive held up a single authoritative hand, stopping my father instantly. The buyer's eyes were scanning the first page of my certified filing, recognizing the undeniable format of a recorded deed. The plaza cannot be sold. I continued, speaking clearly over Richard's frantic breathing, because my father no longer possesses the legal authority to convey the title. As of 1 minute past midnight this morning, coinciding with my 18th birthday, the custodial restrictions governing the property dissolved. The title was irrevocably transferred into a newly formed Nevada Asset Protection Trust. I pointed to the digital recording stamp visible on the top right corner of the second page. I am the sole trustee, and I am the sole beneficiary, I stated. The property is legally shielded, removed from the open market, and entirely insulated from any external creditor claims, bridge loans, or unapproved purchase agreements. The dining alcove fell into a profound, suffocating stillness. The only sound remaining was the faint clinking of dishes from the distant kitchen and the soft, rhythmic hum of the air conditioning. I watched the lead buyer read the red ink of the Washoe County Clerk recording stamp. This was the defining moment, the exact fraction of a second, where the illusion shattered against the bedrock of certified truth. The executive traced the raised notary seal with his index finger, verifying the authenticity of the legal barricade standing between his firm and the Reno plaza. He read the spendthrift provisions, recognizing the ironclad nature of a state-backed trust structure designed specifically to repel unauthorized seizures. His expression shifted. The polite, patronizing confusion of a man indulging a teenager evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, calculating corporate fury. His jaw tightened, the muscles ticking beneath his skin as he processed the reality of the situation. He looked up from the watermarked paper and stared directly at my father. The executive realized that Richard Sterling did not own the asset he had spent weeks negotiating. He realized his firm had wasted immense resources, drafted extensive contracts, and placed millions into escrow based entirely on the forged promises of a desperate fraudster peddling air. The power dynamic at the table inverted without a single voice being raised. The Preston Group officers were no longer guests being courted by a wealthy real estate mogul. They were predators who had just discovered they were lured into a trap by a beggar in a tailored suit. I turned my attention back to my father. He sat frozen in his chair, his complexion shifting to a sickly ash gray. His chest heaved with shallow, rapid breaths, his eyes darting wildly around the alcove, as he searched for an escape route that did not exist. The bridge loans. The margin calls the impending federal scrutiny. Every consequence he had tried to outrun had just caught him at the dinner table. The asset is legally untouchable, I told him, keeping my voice devoid of any vindictive joy or lingering sorrow. Your custodial authority evaporated the moment I came of age. You cannot pledge my future to cover your deficits. I did not need to scream to dismantle his kingdom. I did not need to cry to prove the depth of his betrayal. The execution was flawless, built on the immovable foundation of state law and proper filing procedures. I sat back in my leather chair, folded my hands in my lap, and waited for the fallout to consume the room. The silence inside the private dining alcove pressed inward, heavy and suffocating, like a physical weight settling over the crisp white linen tablecloth. The ambient clinking of silverware from the main dining floor seemed to belong to a different universe. The lead executive from the Preston Group did not raise his voice. Men who wield genuine corporate power rarely need to shout to dismantle a room. He simply gathered the certified trust documents I had provided, aligned the edges with a sharp tap against the mahogany table, and handed them back to me. He stood up, smoothing the front of his bespoke suit jacket with a precise, deliberate motion. His colleague mirrored the action, both men rising in tandem, casting long shadows across my father's untouched crystal water goblet. The lead buyer looked down at Richard, his expression devoid of pity or negotiation, replaced instead by a cold, calculating disgust. He informed my father that their legal department would be initiating contact by Monday morning, regarding the fraudulent negotiations, the deliberate misrepresentation of custodial assets, and the immediate recovery of all escrow expenses incurred during the transaction. He stated that attempting to peddle a commercial property held within an irrevocable trust was not a mere oversight, but a prosecutable federal offense. Without waiting for a response or a defense, the two executives turned and walked out of the private dining alcove. They moved with swift professional efficiency, their polished leather shoes clicking against the imported marble floor as they exited the country club, leaving a catastrophic void in their wake. The departure of the buyers stripped away the final layer of the Sterling family facade, exposing the rapid decay beneath the country club glamour. Sylvia sat frozen in her leather-upholstered chair. the blood draining from her face until her skin mirrored the pale shade of the surrounding frosted glass partitions. Her pristine posture collapsed. Her shoulders slumped forward as the brutal reality of their impending bankruptcy settled over her. The social standing she had cultivated for 2 decades was evaporating in real time, and she lacked the psychological tools to process the descent. She stared at her sparkling water as if the glass had shattered in her hands. The charity galas, the designer wardrobe, the gated estate, all of it rested on the stolen equity of the Reno plaza. Without that capital, her entire identity ceased to exist. Across the table, Harper finally looked up from her glowing phone screen. The dense, terrified silence registering the departure of the executives pierced her usual apathy. She looked at our mother's pale face, then at our father's sweating brow, and the arithmetic of the situation finally connected in her mind. Harper realized the sapphire blue sports car currently parked in our driveway was no longer funded. She realized the elite cheerleading camps and the luxury vacations were unfunded liabilities. Harper did not respond with mature concern for her parents' impending legal jeopardy. She threw an embarrassing shrill tantrum right there in the dining room. She slammed her phone onto the table, whining about her ruined social status. She complained loudly that she had already posted photos of the vehicle online, demanding to know how she was supposed to show her face at school if the car was repossessed by the dealership. Her voice pitched higher and sharper, echoing past the frosted partitions into the main dining floor. She accused our parents of lying to her, her tone laced with a profound, selfish outrage. The noise drew the curious, judgmental stares of the very neighbors Sylvia had spent her life trying to impress. Waiters paused in the corridors, glancing toward our table, witnessing the local real estate royalty unravel over untouched plates of expensive food. Richard could not tolerate the public exposure. The murmurs from the adjacent tables acted like a physical blow to his fragile ego. He slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the silver cutlery and silencing Harper mid-sentence. He attempted to employ his booming authoritative voice, the same commanding tone he used to intimidate junior analysts and service staff. He ordered Harper to shut her mouth, then turned his frantic, bloodshot eyes toward me. The veins in his neck bulged against his starched collar, a visible testament to the severe panic coursing through his bloodstream. He demanded that I contact Valerie Quinn immediately. He ordered me to dissolve the Nevada Asset Protection Trust the moment the law offices opened on Monday morning. He spun a frantic, desperate narrative claiming that as the grantor of the trust, I possessed the authority to reverse the transaction. He told me that I was a confused, naive teenager who had signed complex legal documents I did not understand. He demanded I liquidate the Reno plaza to satisfy his hard money bridge loans, insisting it was my duty to save the family from financial ruin and social exile. He pointed a trembling finger at my face, threatening me with total isolation, disownment, and legal retribution if I refused to dismantle the barricade I had just erected. I maintained my occupational detachment, observing his panic through the lens of a compliance auditor, concluding a final review. I did not shrink back from his pointed finger. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic energy. I simply folded my hands on the table and explained the elegant, unyielding beauty of Nevada trust law. I kept my tone conversational, delivering a lecture on asset protection to a man who had just defaulted on his entire life. I clinically informed him that an irrevocable trust by its very definition and statutory design cannot be dissolved. I explained that under the specific statutes governing the state, not even the grantor possesses the legal authority to pierce the trust veil to satisfy outstanding creditors, repay short-term bridge loans, or bail out a fraudulent enterprise. The structure I had built alongside my attorney was permanent. The assets were locked behind a legal firewall that no court order tied to his personal debts could ever breach. The deed to the Reno Commercial Plaza belonged to the trust, and the trust was immune to his extortion. I outlined the spendthrift provisions detailing how the legislation was engineered specifically to repel hostile actors attempting to coerce the beneficiary. The contrast in the room was stark and undeniable. Richard sat red-faced, sweating profusely, breathing in shallow, rapid gasps as the physical symptoms of severe panic overwhelmed his system. He was socially humiliated, stripped of his authority, and exposed as a fraud in front of his elite country club peers. He was a king without a kingdom, drowning in a rising tide of high-interest debt that he could no longer service. His tailored blazer looked suddenly ill-fitting, draped over a man who was rapidly shrinking under the weight of his own hubris. Opposite him, his 18-year-old daughter sat perfectly composed in a simple navy dress. My heart rate was steady. My posture was relaxed. I had dismantled his entire fraudulent empire, nullified his authoritarian threats, and secured my financial independence using nothing more than a few sheets of properly filed certified paper. The ledger was balanced, and the audit was complete. I watched him process the finality of my words, witnessing the exact moment he realized that his commanding voice held zero currency in my world. The trap he had spent weeks building had snapped shut, but I was not the one caught inside. The facade of the Las Vegas real estate titan peeled away, leaving only a hollow shell of a man drowning in his own deceit. Richard Sterling did not raise his voice again. The bluster and authoritarian threats that had defined his parenting style for 18 years vanished, replaced by a raw, unfiltered desperation. He slumped forward in his leather-upholstered chair, his elbows resting heavily on the white linen tablecloth. He reached up with trembling fingers, loosening the silk tie around his neck as if the fabric were suddenly restricting his airway. His face, previously flushed with panic, settled into a sickly, translucent gray. The polished patriarch was gone. In his place sat a terrified debtor facing the end of his freedom. He leaned across the table, closing the distance between us. He abandoned all pretense of social etiquette, ignoring the curious glances of the wealthy club members dining just beyond our frosted glass partition. When he spoke, his voice was reduced to a hushed, frantic whisper. The words tumbled from his mouth in a chaotic stream of confessions. He admitted everything. He detailed the specific mechanics of his financial ruin, confirming the exact calculations I had already plotted on my spreadsheet. He confessed that the hard money lenders in Scottsdale were not just impatient investors. They were predatory creditors who required strict collateral verification and immediate compliance. Richard explained that he had forged custodial authorization documents to secure those bridge loans months ago. He had pledged the Reno commercial plaza as a guaranteed asset, promising the underwriters a swift liquidation. He looked at me with bloodshot eyes, his chest heaving, and admitted the ultimate consequence of his actions. If the sale to the Chicago firm did not fund by Monday morning, the private equity lenders would trigger a default investigation. They would audit his initial loan applications, discover the deliberate misrepresentation of his custodial powers, and immediately contact federal banking authorities. He was not just facing the loss of his gated estate or his country club membership. He was looking at a federal indictment for wire fraud. He reached across the linen tablecloth, his trembling hand inching toward mine. He did not ask for my forgiveness. He asked for my capital. He begged me to contact Valerie Quinn, pleading with me to instruct my attorney to find a legal loophole in the Nevada trust statutes. He suggested that as the sole beneficiary, I could authorize a new high-interest loan against the Reno property to generate the cash required to satisfy his creditors. He wanted me to leverage my newly secured inheritance to bail out his sinking ship, offering hollow promises of repayment that lacked any basis in reality. He tried to summon a sense of familial duty, invoking a bond he had never taken the time to nurture. He told me that family protects family. He whispered those words like a sacred vow, twisting the concept of loyalty into a tool for financial extortion. He claimed that we had to stick together, that the Sterling name required protection, and that I was the only person capable of saving them from total ruin. He looked up at me, waiting for the natural instinct of a daughter to override the logic of a finance student. I looked at the hand reaching toward me, hovering just above the pristine white fabric of the tablecloth. I did not reach out to meet it. I observed the frantic pleading in his eyes, the silent pale complicity of Sylvia sitting frozen beside him, and the lingering shock on Harper's face. I assessed the three people seated around the table. These were the individuals who had smiled over pastries and poured coffee while actively plotting to strip mine my future. They had intended to liquidate my grandparents' decades of hard work to fund a sapphire blue sports car, a closet full of designer gowns, and the monthly dues for a dining room, where they were currently staging their own demise. They had measured my worth strictly by my utility, classifying my silent obedience as an invitation to steal. They had expected me to absorb the catastrophic consequences of their profound financial incompetence. They assumed I would willingly sacrifice my own security to maintain their hollow performative lifestyle. The staggering entitlement required to ask a child to fund a federal crime was breathtaking, yet it fit perfectly within the architecture of their household ledger. I placed my hands flat on the table and pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped softly against the imported marble floor. I stood up, rising above the chaos of their collapsing world. The physical shift in elevation mirrored the final shift in our power dynamic. I looked down at the man who had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small. I felt no urge to comfort him. I felt no obligation to rescue him. My emotional detachment was complete, leaving behind a pristine, analytical clarity. I looked him directly in the eye, maintaining a level, unyielding voice that carried the finality of a closing bell. Love that requires me to fund your fraud isn't love. I stated the words, hanging crisp and clear in the chilled air of the dining alcove. It is a liability, and I don't carry bad debt. Richard flinched as if the words carried a physical weight. Sylvia covered her mouth with her hand, a small, muffled sob escaping her lips. Harper stared at me, the reality of her new, unfunded existence finally piercing her curated delusion. I did not wait for a rebuttal. I did not offer a closing argument. The audit was complete, and the account was permanently closed. I reached down and picked up my plain manila folder. I secured the certified watermarked trust documents under my arm. I left Richard's fraudulent custodial release contract sitting in the center of the table, flanked by the untouched crystal water goblets. Resting directly on top of his worthless paperwork was the heavy gold monogrammed pen he had intended to use for my execution. I left it there as a monument to his failure, a physical reminder of the signature he would never acquire. I turned my back on my family. I did not look over my shoulder as I walked out of the private dining alcove. I navigated the main floor of the country club, moving past the tables of wealthy patrons dining on seared scallops and vintage wines. The ambient noise of clinking silver and polite conversation washed over me. A few heads turned to watch me leave, sensing the abrupt departure and the tension radiating from the alcove, but I paid them no attention. The opinions of the Las Vegas elite held zero currency in my world. My ledger was balanced. I pushed through the heavy glass double doors and stepped out of the artificially chilled building. The heavy, warm Nevada air washed over me, carrying the scent of dry earth and desert jasmine. The heat was a stark contrast to the cold, suffocating environment I had just escaped. I handed my ticket to the valet, tipped him in cash, and waited for my sensible sedan to be brought to the curb. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and merged onto the quiet suburban street. I drove away from the wrought iron security gates, away from the impending bankruptcies, and away from the people who had tried to consume me. I rolled down the window, letting the warm wind rush through the cabin, feeling a profound, untouchable sense of freedom. 6 months is a standard reporting period in corporate finance. It is also the exact amount of time it takes for a fabricated empire to collapse and a legitimate enterprise to find its footing. I am 19 years old now. I live in a quiet, modest apartment near the university campus, surrounded by textbooks and financial models that reflect actual numbers rather than desperate wishes. The desert winter has settled over Nevada, bringing crisp mornings and cool, clear nights. My days are structured, predictable, and deeply satisfying. I attend my advanced accounting seminars in the morning. I sit in lecture halls listening to professors discuss corporate ethics, fiduciary duties, and hostile takeovers. My classmates take diligent notes, treating these concepts as theoretical exercises required for their degrees. I listen to the lectures with the quiet understanding of a professional who has already executed a flawless defense against a hostile acquisition in the real world. In the afternoons, I review commercial lease agreements and municipal tax assessments. I am not managing my assets alone. Valerie Quinn and I meet once a month in her downtown office. We sit across from her expansive mahogany desk reviewing the revenue generated by the Reno plaza. The national pharmacy chain and the high-end grocery store remit their lease payments on time every single month. The funds route directly into the holding accounts of the Nevada Asset Protection Trust. The yield is steady. The structure is secure. My grandfather built a reliable portfolio, and I am honoring his logic by protecting it. I review the quarterly earnings reports authorizing reinvestments into municipal bonds and index funds. I am building a diversified fortress that will sustain me for decades. I do not speak to my parents. I do not need to speak to them to know the precise arithmetic of their aftermath. Public records tell the story far better than human voices ever could. The Las Vegas estate with its imported stone driveway and wrought iron security gates went into foreclosure 40 days after the country club dinner. The banks did not grant leniency. The hard money lenders initiated hostile collection protocols the moment the Preston Group withdrew their escrow funds. The notices of default were taped to the heavy front doors visible to every wealthy neighbor driving past in their luxury vehicles. The carefully curated social facade dissolved into a public spectacle of insolvency. The country club board of directors quietly requested Richard and Sylvia resign their membership, citing unpaid dues and the desire to avoid scandalous associations. My parents were forced to vacate the premises before the holidays. They hired a discount moving company, packing their remaining possessions into cardboard boxes under the cover of darkness, attempting to hide their exodus from the judging eyes of the gated community. The bank eventually auctioned the property to recover a fraction of the outstanding mortgage debt. The house that had served as their grand stage was sold to a faceless holding company. Harper experienced her own brutal introduction to the mechanics of unsecured debt. The sapphire blue sports car did not remain in her possession for very long. 2 weeks after my 18th birthday, a recovery agent located the vehicle in the student parking lot of her elite private high school. The repossession occurred during the middle of the school day. There was no grand negotiation. A tow truck simply backed into the space, secured the chassis, and towed the luxury import away, while her classmates watched from the cafeteria windows. Harper lost her primary prop. Her social media accounts, once filled with staged photographs of unearned wealth, went silent. With the tuition funds depleted, she was quietly unenrolled from the private academy and transferred to a local public high school. The illusion shattered entirely, leaving her to face the harsh reality of her new socioeconomic status without the buffer of parental money. My father managed to avoid a federal prison sentence, though the margin was exceptionally thin. The Preston Group did not pursue criminal fraud charges because they preferred a swift financial settlement over a drawn-out public trial. The private equity lenders in Scottsdale adopted a similar approach. They demanded immediate restitution for the bridge loans secured by fraudulent collateral. To satisfy these hostile creditors and stay out of a federal courtroom, Richard was forced to liquidate every remaining asset he possessed. He emptied his sparse retirement accounts, incurring severe tax penalties for the early withdrawals. He sold his vintage watches. Sylvia sold her designer jewelry and the designer gowns she had worn to her charity galas. They surrendered every tangible item of value to cover the legal fees and the principal loan balances. They avoided incarceration by rendering themselves functionally broke. Las Vegas was too small of a town for a fallen real estate mogul. The social humiliation was too intense. They fled across state lines. They now rent a small, unremarkable apartment in a generic suburb outside of Phoenix. They live paycheck to paycheck, burdened by the crushing weight of their remaining unsecured debt and the permanent loss of their country club identities. Richard took a mid-level sales job reporting to a manager half his age. Sylvia took a position as a receptionist at a dental office. The ledger balanced itself with ruthless efficiency. I receive occasional emails from Sylvia. They bypass my primary inbox and route directly into a dedicated folder I review once a month for security purposes. The subject lines read like desperate marketing copy from a failing brand. They feature vague, guilt-inducing phrases about forgiveness, family unity, and fresh starts. She writes lengthy paragraphs detailing the hardships of her new life in Arizona, attempting to elicit sympathy. She complains about the heat, the small apartment, and the unfairness of their situation. She references my childhood trying to mine nostalgia for a relationship that only existed in her imagination. She implies that a modest financial contribution from my trust could help them get back on their feet. I do not reply. I do not read the body of the text. I archive the messages the moment I verify they contain no actionable legal threats. I treat her correspondence exactly like spam from a closed account. They are unsolicited solicitations from vendors I no longer do business with. My emotional detachment remains intact. I feel no guilt. I feel no obligation. They gambled their lives on a fraudulent premise and they lost the wager. The peace of a balanced ledger is a profound and quiet thing. When you spend your entire life acting as the silent auditor for people who view you as a disposable resource, you learn to equate love with liability. You learn to anticipate the next extraction, the next demand, the next forced sacrifice. But math is objective. When the final column tallies and you realize you owe nothing to the people who tried to consume you, the world opens up. You realize that a shared last name is merely a biological coincidence, not a binding contract. You learn that your worth is not defined by your utility to desperate people. You are allowed to close the account. You are allowed to walk away from bad debt. You are allowed to build a fortress and refuse to lower the drawbridge. My name is Lorelei Sterling. I am 19 years old, and my future belongs entirely to me. I built a legal wall to protect my legacy, and I watched the people who tried to steal it break themselves against the stone. If you have ever had to legally close the account on your own family to protect your future, drop a comment below. And subscribe to Fluffy Revenge because sometimes the best family planning is a rock-solid trust.
There is a particular kind of silence that settles into a house when the people living inside it stop being a family and start becoming a balance sheet. It does not happen overnight. It is a slow, quiet erosion of the soul, a gradual replacement of warmth with transactions, until one day you wake up and realize the home you built is nothing more than a theater set. The story of the Sterling family and a daughter's cold execution of a financial boundary is far more than a tale of a stolen inheritance. It is a profound indictment of a modern tragedy holding a mirror up to the darkest corners of the American dream and forcing us to question the very foundation of how we raise our children. When we look deeply into the wreckage of that Las Vegas estate, we are not just looking at wire fraud or country club politics. We are looking at a catastrophic failure of self-awareness. In a culture that frequently equates personal value with zip codes, luxury vehicles, and the seamless projection of success, it is dangerously easy for parents to lose their way. The true lesson here is an urgent call for parents to cultivate 3 essential pillars within themselves before they can ever hope to guide their children: profound wisdom, unwavering morality, and authentic courage. Wisdom in parenting does not mean knowing how to navigate elite social circles or how to leverage debt to maintain an illusion. True wisdom is the ability to see through the phantom allure of vanity. Richard and Sylvia were captives of their own delusion, blindly believing that their worth was tethered to a golf course membership and a sprawling stucco mansion. They confused the accumulation of objects with the accumulation of character. To raise a child with long-term guidance, a parent must first wake up from this distorted materialistic slumber. We must recognize that material wealth is fiercely impermanent, and a life built on borrowed status is merely a castle made of sand waiting for the tide. Real peace, the kind of peace that provides a stable environment for a child to grow, stems from a life lived without the suffocating weight of deceit. It comes from the quiet dignity of living within your means, where you never have to force your children to memorize the script of a daily performance. This brings us to the profound collapse of morality within that household. The most devastating corruption of the Sterling parents was not financial. It was the way they monetized their own flesh and blood. They transformed the sacred bond of family into a series of calculated parasitic exchanges. They labeled their younger daughter a golden asset to be showcased, and their eldest daughter an untapped reservoir of capital to be exploited. In a traditional family structure, love must be the sanctuary. It must be unconditional. A child enters this world as an independent life, a spirit entrusted to your care to be nurtured and protected. They are not accessories designed to satisfy a parent's vanity, nor are they human shields meant to absorb the shrapnel of an adult's reckless mistakes. Raising children with emotional awareness means treating them with fundamental fairness. It requires the humility to look inward and feel genuine shame when our own greed or desire for control overshadows our duty to protect. A true home is a fortress where people defend one another from the harshness of the outside world, not a trap where parents deceive their children to ensure their own survival. When we fail to instill fairness and emotional safety, we raise children who learn to view love as a liability. We force them to build their own impenetrable walls just to survive the people who were supposed to be their safe harbor. Yet perhaps the most difficult lesson lies in the concept of courage. True resilience is rarely loud or boastful. It is not the stubborn, fearful clinging to a fabricated identity that Richard displayed when he threatened his daughter to save his own skin. Authentic courage is the bravery to look your family in the eye and admit defeat. If the Sterlings possessed genuine strength, they would have faced their insolvency head-on. They would have sold the mansions, surrendered the luxury cars, and embraced a modest, ordinary life, preserving the one thing that actually mattered, the respect and trust of their children. Instead, paralyzed by the cowardice of worrying about the whispers of their affluent neighbors, they chose to rob their own child. To build a better life, parents must practice the immense inner strength required to let go of the artificial ego. Having the fortitude to live honestly within your actual circumstances, even if those circumstances are humble, requires a depth of character far greater than hiding behind the plastic security of maxed-out credit cards. We must teach our children how to fail with grace, and we can only do that by modeling it ourselves. The destruction of that family did not originate from the outside. The ruin did not come from a trust document or a county clerk's recording stamp. The collapse came entirely from the echoing emptiness within the parents themselves. Lorelei did not destroy her family. She simply declined to finance their ongoing fiction. If we wish to build families that endure, we must first repair ourselves. We must cultivate the wisdom to see the truth, the morality to love without conditions, and the courage to live authentically. Stories like this one strip away the pleasantries and force us to examine the uncomfortable truths hiding just behind the drawn curtains of our own neighborhoods. They remind us why we need spaces to reflect, to share, and to find solace in the shared human experience. If you find yourself searching for these quiet revelations, where the masks come off and the real ledgers of our lives are exposed, join our community. Subscribe to Fluffy Revenge, where we continue to explore the intricate, often hidden dynamics of human relationships and the quiet strength it takes to survive them. You close the screen and sit back in your chair, the ambient hum of your own home settling around you. The house is quiet, save for the faint, steady ticking of a clock in the hallway. You look toward the doorway, listening for the footsteps of the people you are raising, the people you promised to protect. The light shifts, casting a long, unfamiliar shadow across the floorboards. You wonder about the invisible ledgers kept in the silent spaces between words, the unintentional debts passed down through generations. You look at your own reflection in the darkened window pane, searching the lines of your face, suddenly unsure if the person looking back is the architect of a sanctuary or the quiet keeper of a carefully constructed cage.